Hi there. This is a response to the video, The History of Islam in Europe. And first off, I suppose I have to say that there's a great deal of truth in what you have said. I'm not going to dispute a lot of the points that you have made concerning the historical record. Yes, you're absolutely right. The history of Europe and of the European peoples, including Canadians like me, has been pretty much, at least in the last couple of hundred years, the most violent on earth. The First World War, the Second World War, the Holocaust, communism, fascism, the nuclear bomb, that kind of thing. There's no sense in disputing any of this. It's all there as a matter of historical record. History, though, is nowhere near as convenient as we like it to be. If you're going to put the Western civilization, the European civilization, under a microscope, that's all well and good. But if you want to actually have any credibility, you have to be equally scathing or equally critical of other people's histories. Now, I'm not going to say that Muslim people, Arabs in general, or peoples of non-European ancestry, race, culture, that kind of thing, should be ashamed of themselves. Certainly not. But the history of the Islamic world is not without massive blemishes of its own. You just have to ask yourself, how did Islam get to North Africa, to Turkey? Why was the Battle of Poitiers fought in southern France against an Islamic army? Why were the Turks besieging Vienna in 1683? Why did Mahmud of Ghazni loot and destroy Hindu temples? Why did Aurangzeb, the Mughal Emperor of India, turn so harshly against his Hindu subjects? This kind of thing. I'm not saying that I hold any of this against contemporary Muslims. Certainly not. It's just history. It's stuff that happened a long time ago. But if you're going to put the Western civilization under a historical microscope, you have to do the same thing to everyone else. Otherwise, you've got lopsided history. And lopsided history is in many ways the fanatical nationalists' favorite weapon. Well, okay, you can go and distort the truth all you like, but unfortunately the truth keeps going on, as Orwell said, behind your back. Now, one point of clarification, or several points of clarification, I'm very much afraid, that I'm going to have to make is with regard to the emphasis placed on all of this in the West. The Crusades are generally seen in the West as a terrible example of Christian Western arrogance against another culture which was in many ways superior to our own. And I even shouldn't say our own, because I certainly wasn't there. But my ancestors went off to fight in the Holy Land against people who had a civilization that was a lot more pacific, a lot more tolerant, in certain ways a lot more advanced, and a lot less religiously fanatical. And this is a common view in the West. You might not believe this, but unfortunately it is a fact. By the same token, the Iraq War. You seem to imply that the Iraq War is popular in the West. I can only say that if you believe that, you simply don't have a very good grasp of the common mindset of people in the West. The Iraq War is grossly unpopular, even in the United States and Britain. Most people just want it to end, get the soldiers home, and not leave a huge mess behind. That's the only thing that's keeping them there, if you ask me, is they're trying to make sure that the damage that has been done doesn't result in another Lebanon, another Bosnia, or another Iran. It's just that they don't know how to get out. Now, I'm not making excuses for that. I'm not saying that they shouldn't just pull up stakes and leave immediately if that's what people ultimately want in the region. That's fine. But don't say that it's a popular war in the West. It's not. It's routinely attacked in the press, on the news, in editorial columns, in books, novels, that kind of thing. It's all seen in most quarters nowadays as a colossal mistake. Secondly, you seem to imply that the colonial period is never criticized in the Western historical record. Sorry, it's generally seen as an example of 19th century Victorian, or the equivalent, arrogance, racial pride gone amok, a sense of superiority against people, again, who were in many ways more advanced than the Europeans, except for in terms of, say, empire building and armaments and scientific advancement. It is criticized. It is some people do idealize it, I agree, but it is also criticized, it is also attacked, and often seen as the source of so many of the problems that we're encountering today. So I have to say that in those 2 points, I don't think that you really understand the Western mindset. Now, finally, I would like to mention what I believe, or what looks to me to be, the sting in the tail of what you're saying. At the end of your video, you seemed to imply a threat. You touch the Muslims in your midst, and the Westerners in our midst are in big trouble. Now, you may actually be right. This may happen whether or not you say it will happen. I agree. You may actually be correct. But whenever you actually say things like this, it is perceived by people as a threat, a challenge, an invitation to a show of strength. Okay, maybe that's exactly what it is. But I have to say, to be perfectly honest, and this is not a threat, although I'm sure it's going to be seen as one, but I'm simply stating a fact, regardless of how imperfect my powers of speech are in expressing this. I'm simply trying to say that in a show of strength between the West and the Islamic world, there is no question as to who would win and who would lose. This is a very, very, very important thing to bear in mind. We don't want a war, and I don't mean we as the West, I mean we as human beings. We don't want a clash of civilizations. I don't think the Islamic world does, and yes, I am familiar with the Islamic world. I've traveled a great deal there. Neither one wants anything more than live and let live. You'll always have a few hotheads out there stirring the pot. I think that it's incumbent on each of us, though, if we are people of goodwill, to avoid becoming hotheads of that nature, who are saying, we're going to get you, and you know that there are people on both sides who are talking like this. So I would avoid statements like that simply say, oh, we're superior to you and we're going to win. Because all that really does is makes people think, I'm being threatened. And when you're being threatened, well, what do? You reach for your gun, don't you? So let's just not have that kind of discussion. I'm not so naive as to think that we're actually going to sit down and all be nice to each other on the internet. In many ways, YouTube and the internet is simply a vehicle for us all to tell each other how much we can't stand each other and how little we think of each other. But most people of goodwill really ought to get into the discourse and say, how do we sort this out? How do we avoid trouble in the future? How do we make this a world that we all want to live in? This is possible, if you ask me. It is desirable, especially in view of the fact that one day we may all wake up surrounded by a world that we really don't like, a pile of ruins maybe, saying, how did we get to this point? We could have avoided this. So let's dampen down the belligerence, shall we? Thank you.